Ormoc Bay, on the western coast of the Philippine island of Leyte, the morning of December 7, 1944. An American fast transport was burning in the water. She was an old four-stack destroyer launched in 1918, converted late in her life to carry troops. Fires had taken hold in compartments her crew could not reach. She was not going to be saved. Her name was USS Ward. 3 years earlier, at 6:05 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Ward had spotted a Japanese midget submarine trying to follow a cargo ship through the anti-submarine net at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. She put a 4-inch shell through its conning tower and dropped depth charges on it. That was the first recorded American shot fired in the Pacific War. It was fired more than an hour before the first aircraft appeared over Oahu. The officer who gave that order was a lieutenant named William Outerbridge. It was his second day in command. Now it was December 7th again, exactly 3 years to the day, and the destroyer ordered to sink the burning Ward to put her under before she drifted into the landing area was USS O'Brien. O'Brien's commanding officer was William Outerbridge. He fired into his own former ship until she went down in a bay on the far side of the ocean. On the anniversary of the morning, she fired the opening shot of the war. That is not a story someone invented afterward. It is in the record. To understand how that ship came to be in that bay on that particular morning, you have to go back 7 weeks to an island nobody in Tokyo had planned to defend, and to a victory that never happened. By the autumn of 1944, the Japanese Empire was still enormous on a map and starting in practice. The outer defensive ring built after the victories of 1941 and 1942 had collapsed. The Marshall Islands were gone. Japanese naval aviation had been shattered in the Philippine Sea that summer. The Marianas had fallen, which put American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time in the war. What Japan still held was the southern resource area, the oil fields of Borneo, the rubber and tin and ore of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. Those resources were among the central reasons Japan had gone to war in the first place. But by late 1944, owning oil was no longer the same thing as having it. American submarines had spent nearly 3 years dismantling Japanese merchant shipping. Tankers moving crude north toward the refineries of the home islands were being sunk faster than the shipyards could replace them. Freighters carrying ammunition, rice, vehicles, and machine parts were disappearing across the South China Sea month after month, and every one of those shipping routes ran past the same archipelago. The Philippines sat directly across Japan's supply line to its own war economy. Whoever held those islands controlled whether oil from Borneo ever reached a Japanese engine. If the Americans took the Philippines, Japan would still technically own its resource area and would be entirely unable to use it. The Imperial High Command understood this completely. That is why the coming battle would not be treated as one campaign among many. It would be treated as the last one that mattered. And then in October, Japan received news of a victory. Between the 12th and the 16th of October 1944, American carrier aircraft struck Japanese airfields on Formosa and in the Ryukyus, softening the region ahead of the Philippine invasion. Japanese aircraft rose to meet them and were slaughtered. Hundreds of planes were lost across those 4 days, but the pilots who survived came home with reports. They reported that they had sunk 11 American aircraft carriers. They reported battleships and cruisers burning. They reported that the American fleet had been broken in the waters east of Formosa. Almost none of it was true. 2 American cruisers were badly damaged by torpedoes and towed clear. Not a single American aircraft carrier was sunk. Not one. The reports were not deliberate lies. They were the predictable result of inexperienced aviators attacking at night through anti-aircraft fire over open water, watching explosions on a dark sea and reporting what they believed they had seen. Japan had lost so many veteran pilots by that point that the men flying these missions often had no realistic way to assess what they had hit. The problem was that Tokyo believed them. Imperial General Headquarters accepted the reports. Newspapers announced the victory. Celebrations were held. The Emperor issued a congratulatory message based on reports that were later proven to be greatly exaggerated. On the American side, Admiral William Halsey heard the Japanese radio claims and reported with some amusement that all of his supposedly sunken ships had salvaged and were now retiring at high speed toward the enemy. It should have been a strange footnote. Instead, it became the foundation of everything that followed, because Japan's high command now believed something specific and dangerous. They believed the American fleet had been gutted. They believed the invasion force approaching the Philippines was weaker than it actually was. They believed a decisive counterstroke might still succeed. Every catastrophic decision made in the following weeks was made by men working from that false picture. The first turn in this story is not a battlefield turn. Tens of thousands of soldiers were about to be committed because a group of exhausted young pilots reported sinking ships that were still afloat. At 10 o'clock in the morning on October 20th, 1944, the invasion began. More than 700 ships stood off the eastern coast of Leyte. Battleships fired into the coastal defenses. Carrier aircraft worked the roads and artillery positions further inland. Roughly 174,000 American troops of the 6th Army began coming ashore across a front more than 20 miles wide. In the north, 10th Corps landed near Palo and Maras Barras with the 1st Cavalry Division and the 24th Infantry Division. 15 miles to the south, 24th Corps landed near Dulag and San Jose with the 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions. Later that day, General Douglas MacArthur went ashore near Red Beach with Philippine President Sergio Osmeña. The landing craft could not reach the dock. The beachmaster, working a crowded shoreline on a schedule of his own, refused to clear space for the party of senior officers. So MacArthur waded in through the surf. Photographers recorded it. The image became one of the most famous of the Pacific War, and the man in it knew exactly what it would look like. At a portable radio microphone on the beach, he spoke to the Filipino people. He told them he had returned. 2.5 years earlier, he had left the Philippines on direct orders from President Roosevelt while the defense collapsed behind him. Thousands of the men he left were still prisoners. Many were already dead. By nightfall on the first day, American forces held Tacloban Airfield, the high ground above the beaches, and the town of Dulag. They had pushed as much as 2 miles inland. The cost of that entire first day was 49 Americans killed, 192 wounded, and 6 missing. 49 men on the opening day of the largest amphibious operation yet mounted in the Pacific, which raises the obvious question. If the invasion of Leyte cost the Americans 49 dead on the day it began, where did the tens of thousands of Japanese dead come from? The answer is that most of them were not on the island yet. One honest note before going further, because you will see it argued about in the comments. The number of Japanese dead on Leyte has never been settled. American body counts reported through MacArthur's headquarters came to 80,557. Serious historians put the figure as low as 49,000. Keep that range in mind. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why nobody can close it. American intelligence estimated the Japanese garrison on Leyte at roughly 21,700 men. About half belonged to a single formation. The rest were largely service and support troops, not frontline infantry. That single formation was the 16th Division. In April of 1942, the 6th Division had been one of the Japanese units responsible for the prisoners taken at Bataan. Those prisoners, American and Filipino, were marched roughly 65 miles under guard in tropical heat without adequate water, food, or medical care. Thousands died on the road. Thousands more died in the camps at the end of it. Most of the individual men standing on the beaches of Leyte in October of 1944 were not the same men who had walked that road. Divisions absorbed replacements. 2.5 years of war had turned over much of the roster, but the unit was the same. The banner was the same, and within 10 weeks that division would effectively cease to exist on this island. It is not justice. Nothing about what followed on Leyte functions as justice. It is simply the shape the history took. Now comes the part of this story that is most often told wrong. The common version says that General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, warned Tokyo before the invasion that Leyte was the wrong island and was overruled. That is not what happened. Yamashita had arrived in Manila only weeks before the American landings. He was 58 years old, newly assigned and still assembling a picture of a theater he had not commanded before. The existing Japanese plan for the decisive defense of the Philippines was built around Luzon, the largest island, with the terrain, the road network, and the depth to sustain a long campaign. Leyte was not the plan. Leyte became the plan afterward. Around the 22nd of October, 2 days after American troops were already ashore and soliciting their beachhead, Field Marshal Hisaichi Terachuchi, commanding the Southern Expeditionary Army Group from Manila, directed that the decisive battle be fought on Leyte itself. He was 65 years old. He would issue orders for this campaign for its entire duration, and he would never set foot on the island. Yamashita objected. He argued that reinforcing Leyte under American naval and air superiority would consume divisions he needed for Luzon. Then he obeyed, and this is worse than the version usually told. Japan did not choose Leyte as a strategic gamble before the battle. Japan chose Leyte as a reaction after the Americans had already landed, on the strength of a naval victory that had never occurred. On the ground, the order landed on Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, 53 years old, commanding the 35th Army. He was the officer who would have to make it real. He would spend the next 2 months trying to fight a decisive battle with an army that arrived east on an island where the rain never stopped. The reinforcements began moving almost immediately. From Manila, from Cebu, from across the archipelago toward one small port on the western coast of Leyte called Ormoc. They were sailing into the narrowest stretch of water the Americans controlled most completely. On the night of October 23, 1944, 2 American submarines were sitting on the surface in Palawan Passage, waiting. Their names were Darter and Dace. They had picked the Japanese fleet on radar hours earlier, in the dark, moving north through the narrow water west of the Philippines. They shadowed it all night, sending contact reports, then submerged before dawn and let it come to them. At about 5:30 in the morning, Darter fired. The heavy cruiser Atago took 4 torpedoes on her starboard side. She was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's flagship, and she went down in under 20 minutes, with much of the admiral's staff still aboard. Kurita, 55 years old, ended up in the water. A destroyer pulled him out. He was transferred, soaked, and without most of the passengers who were supposed to help him think, to the battleship Yamato. Minutes later, Dace put 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Maya. Maya's magazines detonated. She was gone in 4 minutes. The largest naval operation Japan would ever attempt had been underway for less than a day, and the Americans now knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was. The following morning, carrier aircraft found Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. What followed was a sustained series of American carrier air attacks that gradually overwhelmed Musashi. Wave after wave came in through the anti-aircraft fire, and they concentrated on the largest target in the formation. Musashi was one of the 2 largest battleships ever built. 72,000 tons at full load, guns 18 inches across, capable of throwing a shell weighing more than a small automobile over 20 miles. She was designed to be effectively unsinkable by conventional means. She absorbed bomb after bomb and torpedo after torpedo across most of a day. Her bow went down until the sea was washing over her forward deck. Her speed fell away. She fell out of formation, and the fleet went on without her. She rolled over and sank in the early evening. Roughly 1,023 of her crew went down with her. The Americans did not come through it clean. That same day, a single Japanese bomber put 1 bomb into the light carrier Princeton. The fire reached her torpedo stowage. When she blew, the explosion swept the deck of the cruiser Birmingham, which had come alongside to fight the fire and had her crew standing exposed at the rails. More than 200 men on Birmingham were killed by that one blast. They were not on the burning ship. They were trying to save it. But Kurita kept coming, and while every eye was on the Sibuyan Sea, the second act of the Japanese plan was quietly succeeding. Far to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was steaming in circles with 4 aircraft carriers, trying to get somebody to notice him. His carriers were nearly empty. Japan had lost most of its trained naval aviators in the Philippine Sea that summer, and the flight decks under Ozawa's command carried a fraction of the aircraft they were built for. He was not there to fight a carrier battle. He knew he could not fight one. He was bait. He knew that too, and so did every man on those ships. Ozawa's job was to be found. His job was to pull Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet away from the landing beaches long enough for Kurita to slip through and reach the invasion transports. American search planes finally spotted him on the afternoon of October 24th. Halsey took the Third Fleet north, all of it. The fast carriers, the fast battleships, the whole striking force, and the San Bernardino Strait, the passage that led directly into the waters off the invasion beaches, was left unguarded. The Japanese deception had worked exactly the way it was drawn up on paper. Ozawa spent his ships to open that door, and the door opened. While Halsey was steaming north, a different Japanese force was trying to come in through the back door. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura took a small squadron into Suristro in the darkness of the early hours of October 25th. 2 battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, 1 heavy cruiser, Mogami, 4 destroyers. His orders were to force the strait and reach the landing area from the south. Waiting for him at the far end was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. Oldendorf had set up something naval officers had studied for 400 years and almost never gotten the chance to do. He had lined his battleships across the exit of the strait, broadside on, so that every gun in his line could fire while the enemy coming up the channel could answer only with his forward turrets. So, crossing the T, the oldest dream in naval gunnery, the Japanese column came up the strait in the dark and ran a gauntlet. First the PT boats. Then the destroyers, coming in with torpedoes at close range. Ships in the Japanese line began taking hits and dropping out before they ever saw an American battleship. And then, just before 4 in the morning, the battle line opened fire. 6 American battleships were in that line. West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, Pennsylvania. 5 of them had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. 5 of them had been bombed, torpedoed, burned, or sunk in the mud of Pearl Harbor. They had been raised, patched, rebuilt, and given new fire control radar that let them shoot accurately at targets they could not see. Now they were firing into the dark at the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the Japanese ships could not effectively shoot back. Yamashiro took the weight of it. She kept firing as she burned. She capsized and sank with Nishimura still aboard. Fuso was lost as well. Of the 7 ships that entered Surigao Strait that night, only the destroyer Shigeor came out intact. Mogami escaped the strait on fire and was finished by aircraft before the day ended. The battleship Mississippi fired the last full salvo of the engagement. It was the last time in history that battleships fought battleships. It ended in a dark channel in the Philippines at close range before dawn, and the men firing the guns did not know they were closing a chapter that had been open since the age of sail. By sunrise on October 25th, Japan had lost its southern force in Surigao Strait, and Kurita was through the San Bernardino Strait in open water with Yamato. Off the island of Samar that morning were 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. They were designated Task Units 77.4.3. The men called them Taffy 3. They were commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, 48 years old. Escort carriers were built to a merchant hull design with wooden flight decks and a single 5-inch gun aft. Slow, thin-skinned, unarmored. Their job was to fly anti-submarine patrols and the troops ashore. They were not warships in the sense that Yamato was a warship. Nothing in that formation was. At a few minutes before 7 in the morning, lookouts saw anti-aircraft bursts on the horizon and heard a pilot reporting Japanese battleships. The first assumption on the American ships was that somebody had made a mistake in identification. Then the shell splashes started landing among them. Colored dye, the kind battleships used to spot their own fall of shot, and through the haze came the pagoda masts. Kurita had Yamato, Nagato Kongo, and Haruna. He had 6 heavy cruisers. Against him were 7 small escorts and 6 thin-skinned carriers with wooden decks. Sprague turned east into the wind, launched everything that would fly, and ordered his destroyers to make a torpedo attack. He was ordering Sevshen ships to charge a battle fleet. The first one in did not wait for the order. The destroyer Johnston was commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, 36 years old, from Pawnee, Oklahoma, of Cherokee and Creek descent. When he took command of the ship the year before, he had told his crew that this was going to be a fighting ship, and that anyone who did not want to go in harm's way had better get off. Johnston went in alone, ahead of the others, laying smoke and firing her 5-inch guns at a heavy cruiser. She got close enough to launch torpedoes and hit the cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Then the battleships found her. 3 14-inch shells and 3 6-inch shells hit Johnston. They took out an engine room, half her power, and 1 gun mount. Evans was hit in the torso and lost 2 fingers from his left hand. He refused to leave the bridge and refused medical treatment. The ship kept fighting for 2 more hours. When the destroyer Heermann and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts went in with their own attacks, Johnston, already crippled, went with them, firing whatever guns still worked, drawing fire off the others. The Japanese finally surrounded her and shot her to pieces at close range. She went down at about 10 in the morning. Survivors in the water said a Japanese destroyer captain stood at attention and saluted as she sank. Ernest Evans was not among the survivors. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Hull was sunk. Samuel B. Roberts was sunk. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was hit by heavy cruisers at point-blank range and went down. The only American aircraft carrier in the entire war lost to enemy surface gunfire. Pilots off those carriers flew until they had nothing left. When the bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dry runs at Japanese cruisers with empty racks, just to break up the formation. Some strafed battleship bridges with machine guns that could not scratch the armor. They landed on any deck that would take them, rearmed with whatever was on hand, and went out again. And then, at about 11 minutes past 9 in the morning, Takeo Kurita signaled his fleet to break off and turn north. He was less than 3 hours steaming from Leyte Gulf. The invasion transports and supply ships were in there, crowded together, lightly protected, exactly the target Operation Shinjugoho had been designed to reach. He had gotten through, and he turned around. Historians have argued about why for 80 years his communications were shattered. He had been in the water once already. He believed, from garbled reports, that he was facing fleet carriers rather than escort carriers. He believed a large American force was closing on him. He had lost ships all morning. He had been under air attack for 2 days with no air cover of his own. Whatever the reasons, this is the fact. The entire Japanese plan, the spending of Ozawa's carriers, the destruction of Nishimura's squadron, the loss of Musashi, all of it existed to put Kurita's guns in Leyte Gulf. He was there, and he went home. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again mount a major fleet offensive on the scale of Leyte Gulf. Later that same morning, something else happened off Samar. The surviving ships of Taffy 3 had barely begun sorting their dead when aircraft came in low out of the sun. They did not drop bombs and pull away. At about 10 minutes to 11, a single-engine Japanese fighter carrying a bomb dove into the flight deck of the escort carrier St. Lo. It punched through the wooden deck and detonated in the hangar, where fueled and armed aircraft were sitting. The secondary explosions tore the ship apart from the inside. Her flight deck lifted. Ordnance cooked off below. St. Lo sank in roughly 30 minutes. About 113 of her men died. She became the first major Allied warship sunk by an organized kamikaze attack. The unit that did it was called the Shikishima Special Attack Unit. It was led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, from Ehime Prefecture, and he had been married for 5 months. Seki was not a fanatic. He was a skilled dive bomber pilot, one of the better ones his Navy had left, which is precisely why he was chosen. By the accounts that survive, he did not volunteer eagerly. He accepted because he was ordered to, and because refusing was not a real option for a career officer in the Japanese Navy in 1944. He is reported to have said in substance that a country which has to order its best pilots to crash their aircraft has already lost. He was right, and he flew anyway. That is the thing that gets flattened when this story is told badly. The kamikaze campaign did not begin with a wave of enthusiasm. It began because the Japanese Navy had run out of trained pilots, run out of fuel to train new ones, and run out of any conventional method of hitting an American task force that stood a reasonable chance of working. It was an admission of defeat designed to look like resolve, and it would kill thousands of American sailors between that morning and the end of the war. That same afternoon in the waters north of Luzon, the bill for the deception came due. Halsey's aircraft found Ozawa's carriers off Cape Engano and crippled all 4 of them. Chitose went down. Zuiho went down. Chiyoda was left burning and dead in the water, and American cruisers came up that afternoon and finished her. And Zuikaku. Zuikaku was the last surviving aircraft carrier from the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. She had been there at the beginning. She went down on the afternoon of the 25th, and when she did, every one of those 6 Pearl Harbor flight decks was on the bottom of the ocean. Ozawa himself survived. He transferred his flag to a light cruiser and brought what was left of his force home. He would end the war as the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, presiding over a navy that no longer existed, and he would live until 1966. Japan had traded its carriers for an open strait, and the man who came through the strait had turned back. While all of this was happening at sea, the decision made in Manila on the 22nd of October was being carried out. Japan began feeding men into Leyte. The only usable door was that small port on the western coast, Ormoc. Everything came through it. Troops, ammunition, artillery, rice, fuel, medical supplies. 9 convoys ran between the 9th of November and the 21st of December. The Japanese called them the TA operations. The Americans called it the Ormoc Run. Roughly 34,000 additional soldiers were landing on Leyte through those convoys, drawn from the 1st, 8th, 26th, 30th, and 102nd Divisions. Thousands more never got off the ships. On the morning of November 11th, an American strike caught a convoy in Ormoc Bay before it reached the harbor. The transports burned and broke apart within sight of the coastline. Men went into the water carrying full packs and were pulled under by the weight of the equipment they had been issued for a battle they would never join. They were soldiers of the 26th Division. They died as reinforcements for a fight they never saw on an island they never set foot on. There is a detail in the intelligence record that says everything about how badly Tokyo had misjudged this. American codebreakers reading Japanese signal traffic saw the shipping concentrating around Leyte in early November. Their first interpretation was that the Japanese were organizing an evacuation. It did not occur to them that anyone would deliberately send divisions into that water. Within a week, they understood, and the interdiction began. The pattern was always the same. The convoys sailed at night, hugging the coast, using rain squalls for cover. They tried to reach Ormoc Bay before dawn and unload before the American aircraft found them. The aircraft found them. By November, American fighters and bombers were operating from captured airfields on Leyte itself. That cut the response time to almost nothing. A convoy sighted at first light could be under attack within the hour. The 3rd convoy, in mid-November, carried about 2,000 men of the 26th Division and 6,000 tons of munitions in 5 transports. It was escorted by destroyers, including Shimakaze, the fastest destroyer in the Japanese Navy. American aircraft caught the entire convoy in Ormoc Bay. The transports were destroyed. Shimakaze was destroyed. The ammunition those ships carried, ammunition that Japanese soldiers in the mountains were already running short of, went to the bottom of the bay. Later convoys got through partially. One of the last put roughly 4,000 men ashore at Palampon, up the coast, because Ormoc itself had become too dangerous to enter. 2 of its escorting destroyers were sunk in the days that followed, one by aircraft and one by American PT boats working the bay at night. Men who did land arrived without their heavy weapons, because the ships carrying the artillery had already been sunk. They arrived without food because the supply vessels had been sunk. They arrived exhausted, having spent the voyage under air attack, and they were sent immediately into the mountains. And here is the trap. Every destroyer Japan lost running troops into Ormoc was a destroyer that would not be available to defend Luzon in January. Every transport sunk in that bay was one less hull carrying oil north toward the home islands. Every division committed to Leyte was a division that would not be dug into the mountains of Luzon when the Americans came there next. Japan was losing men both because of American operations on Leyte and because it continued feeding reinforcements into an increasingly hopeless campaign. Japan was losing men on Leyte because Japan would not stop sending men to Leyte. The reinforcement was the killing mechanism. It fed the battle and it fed the collapse at the same time, and it could not be stopped because stopping would have meant admitting in public that the decisive battle had already been decided. Inland, the fighting had moved off the coastal plain and into the mountains. The center of it was a ridge above the town of Le Mans, on the only real road across the island. The Americans named it Breakneck Ridge. It was not one ridge. It was a tangle of spurs, ravines, and knobs covered in jungle, where a defender could hold a position that was invisible from 30 yards away. The Japanese 1st Division, freshly landed at Ormoc and still relatively intact, dug into it. The 24th Infantry Division went up first, and then the 32nd Infantry Division, the Red Arrow, took over. It took more than a month. Every spur had to be cleared separately. Some positions were reduced one bunker at a time with flamethrowers and demolition charges because there was no other way to get at them. Nearby, a single American battalion held a position called Kille Ridge for close to a month, cut off from easy resupply, hauling ammunition and water up by hand and on the backs of Filipino carriers. And over all of it, it rained. The monsoon arrived and did not let up. Roads became channels of liquid mud. Trucks could not move. Artillery had to be dragged. The airfields the Americans had captured on the eastern coast, the ones the whole plan depended on, turned out to be built on ground that would not drain, and the engineers fought the water for weeks. Wounded men could not be moved quickly because there was nothing to move them on. Foxholes filled with water and stayed full. Feet rotted inside boots. Here is the number that tells you what Leyte actually was. American battle deaths in the campaign came to about 3,504, with roughly 12,000 wounded. American non-battle casualties, primarily disease cases, exceeded 36,000, more than 10 sick men for every man killed by the enemy. That was the side with air superiority, sea control, field hospitals, and an unbroken supply line. On the Japanese side, there was no such accounting because there was no such system left. Units in the mountains ran out of rice within weeks. Men ate roots, coconuts, and whatever the jungle gave them. Malaria and dysentery moved through the formations. Soldiers too weak to walk stayed in their positions because there was nowhere to send them and no one to carry them. They were not being defeated in battle. Many of them were simply being left to die in place by a command structure that had lost the ability to reach them. By the beginning of December, Sosaku Suzuki understood that he could not hold the island by defending it, so Japan tried something else. On the night of the 6th of December, transport aircraft came in low over the airfields at Burauen in the middle of the island and dropped a few hundred paratroopers of the Sect Parachute Group directly onto the American airstrips. The plan was called Operation Wa. The paratroopers were to seize the airfields. At the same time, the 16th Division and elements of the 6th Division, already in the hills to the west, were to attack overland and link up with them. It was the most ambitious thing the Japanese attempted on Leyte. It was also, on paper, not absurd. Those airfields were the reason American aircraft were killing the Ormoc convoys. Bad weather forced a delay. The drop was postponed from the 5th of December to the 6th. The 16th Division never received the message. Communications had degraded so badly that an order postponing the operation by 24 hours did not reach the ground force that was supposed to coordinate with it. On the 5th of December, the 16th Division acted on schedule, alone. A full day before the paratroopers arrived, they seized part of the Buri airstrip and then had to hold it by themselves against American units that now knew exactly what was coming. When the paratroopers finally dropped on the evening of the 6th, they landed on an alerted enemy. Some of them came down on top of the 11th Airborne Division, American paratroopers who happened to be bivouacked in the area and who understood better than anyone what a scattered airborne force is vulnerable to in the first 10 minutes on the ground. The Japanese destroyed some aircraft and burned some supply dumps. They held pieces of the airstrips for a few days. Then they were hunted down. The last coordinated offensive operation of the Japanese army on Leyte failed because a radio message about a weather delay did not get through. That is what an army looks like when it is coming apart. Not a collapse of courage. A collapse of the connective tissue that makes an army something other than a collection of men in a jungle. On the morning of the 7th of December, the Americans stopped trying to reach Ormoc through the mountains. The 77th Infantry Division, under Major General Andrew Bruce, came ashore from the sea at a place called Deposito, a few miles south of the town. The entire Japanese defense was oriented east, toward the ridges where the fighting had been grinding forward for 6 weeks. The landing came in behind all of it. Covering that landing was the old converted four-stacker we started with. That is the morning Ward burned, and that is the morning William Outerbridge was ordered to sink her. 3 years to the day. Ormoc fell on December 10th. With it went the last usable port on Leyte. There would be no more convoys. No more ammunition, no more rice, no more replacements, no evacuation. Whatever the Japanese still had on that island in the second week of December was all they were ever going to have. Bruce, who had been racing 2 neighboring divisions to the objective, signaled his corps commander that he had rolled 2 7s in Ormoc. On Christmas Day, American troops landed at Palampan and closed the last small harbor the Japanese had been using. The next day, December 26th, General MacArthur announced that organized resistance on Leyte had ended. The 6th Army handed the island over to the 8th Army, and the campaign was officially complete. Here is what that sentence actually meant. Through December 25th, American forces counted roughly 56,000 Japanese dead on Leyte. Between December 26th and the following May, the 8th Army counted more than 24,000 more. 24,000 men died after the battle was declared over. They were not fighting a campaign anymore. There was no line, no headquarters worth the name, no supply. They were scattered through the mountains of central Leyte in groups of 10 and 20 and 50, some still under an officer, many not. They ate what the jungle had. They died of malaria and dysentery and starvation in ravines where nobody found them for years. Some of them fought when they were found. Some were too weak to lift a rifle. In the official record, none of that is a battle. It is filed under a phrase the Army used for the months that followed the announcement. Mopping up. And that is the phrase that explains the number in the title. You will find the figure 79,000 attached to Leyte everywhere. You will also find 49,000. You will find 80,557, which is the American count, and which historians have argued about for 80 years. The gap between the low estimate and the high one is more than 30,000 men. That is an entire Army Corps, unaccounted for. The reason nobody can close that gap is simple, and it is ugly. A great many of the Japanese who died on Leyte were not killed in engagements that anyone recorded. They starved. They died of disease in the rain, in terrain where there was no one to count them and no one to report it. Their own army had lost the ability to know where they were. The American army had no reason to go looking. The uncertainty reflects the difficulty of accounting for soldiers who died from combat, disease, starvation, or in isolated mountain positions. It is the shape of what happened to them. Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, who had been handed the impossible order and told to make it work, held out in the mountains into the new year. In the spring of 1945, he tried to move by small boat toward Mindanao to keep fighting somewhere else. American aircraft caught him at sea in April. He was 53 years old. The 16th Division, the formation that had garrisoned Leyte in October and that had been at Bataan in 1942, ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A few hundred men out of many thousands came off that island, and on Luzon, General Tomoyuki Yamashita finally fought the campaign he had wanted to fight all along. The Americans landed at Lingayen Gulf on the 9th of January, 1945. Yamashita withdrew into the mountains in the north and held out for 7 months. He surrendered on the 2nd of September, 1945, the day the war formally ended. But by then, the divisions he had needed for that defense were bones in the mountains of Leyte, and something else had happened that he could not undo. He had ordered Manila abandoned. Naval troops in the city, under a different chain of command, refused to go. In February and March of 1945, in a month of street fighting and massacre, roughly 100,000 Filipino civilians died there. Yamashita was tried in that city. He was sentenced on the 7th of December 1945 and hanged on the 23rd of February 1946. He was 60 years old. The case established what lawyers still call the Yamashita standard. the principle that a commander bears responsibility for the acts of his troops. Two justices of the United States Supreme Court, Franka Murphy and Wiley Rutledge, dissented in furious language, arguing that a man had been convicted for failing to control forces he no longer had the ability to reach. That argument has never been settled. It is worth knowing both halves of it. He was not a good man being punished for another man's crime, and he was not simply guilty in the ordinary sense either. He was the commander, and 100,000 civilians died. Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi, who ordered the decisive battle fought on Leyte from an office in Manila, never set foot on the island. He suffered a stroke in 1945 and was left partly paralyzed. He surrendered at the end of the war and was held by the British in Malaya. He died there in June of 1946 of another stroke before any proceeding against him could begin. Field Marshal Terauchi died before he could face trial, while General Yamashita was tried and executed after the war. That is not immoral. It is only what happened. What Leyte cost in the end was not measured in ground. It cost Japan its carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and the last surviving flight deck from the force that struck Pearl Harbor. What remained of that navy sailed once more toward Okinawa in April of 1945, and Yamato did not come back. It cost Japan the Philippines, and with the Philippines went the sea lanes carrying oil from Borneo. The empire still owned the oil after Leyte. It could no longer get it home. It cost Japan the divisions that should have defended Luzon, which is why the campaign there, when it came, was fought by an army already short of everything. And it introduced something that would not stop. The suicide attacks that began off Samar on the 25th of October went on to Lingayen, to Iwo Jima, and to Okinawa, where they came in waves of hundreds. Before it was over, thousands of American sailors would be killed by aircraft flown deliberately into their ships. Men who had survived the Atlantic, survived the Solomons, survived 3 years of war, died on a destroyer picket line in 1945 because a 20-year-old with 60 hours of flight training had been told there was no other way left. Leyte was not the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Many historians regard it as one of the most strategically decisive campaigns of the Pacific War. The beaches are still there. At Palo, on the eastern shore, there is a memorial standing in the shallow water where MacArthur came ashore. Tourists photograph it. Fishing boats go past it. The mountains in the center of the island have grown back over the ridges where the Red Arrow fought for a month in the rain. The foxholes have filled in. The bunkers have gone into the ground. Ormoc Bay is quiet water now. There are ships on the bottom of it carrying men who never saw the island. Estimates of Japanese deaths on Leyte range from roughly 49,000 to over 80,000, depending on the source, across 68 days of official campaign and the 5 months of silence that followed. Nobody will ever know the real figure. The men who could have counted them were dying alongside them. Approximately 3,500 American battle deaths were recorded during the Leyte campaign, and another 37,000 were carried off that island sick. Most of them came home and did not talk about it much. Leyte was not Normandy, and it was not Iwo Jima. It did not get the movies. For a long time, it was a name their families had heard once or twice, usually in passing, usually late at night. If one of those men was your father, or your uncle, or the neighbor 2 doors down who never said a word about the Pacific, this was what he was in. Thank you for watching.